Good, good. Okay, so this evening we're going to introduce the concept of what's called the spiritual field. And in a way, the first image that I want to introduce is that in the mindful practice, when I get a hold of myself with this container of awareness, the more that I practice that, the more stable my energy and resilient my energy becomes. And that's a real benefit of modern day mindfulness. It creates stability, space, the ability to get a hold of yourself and not feel so overwhelmed and chaotic in response to life. And they're all really useful qualities to have. Isn't that true? So we're working with this container of awareness towards ourselves, towards ourselves. And then where does the spirituality come in? The more that I connect with the awareness of myself, the more I begin then to, as I broaden my practice, to realize that there's another container holding me, which is the wider spiritual field. And this is a direct experience. So oftentimes in my meditation, when I'm sitting on my chairs in my meditation practices, I'll spend a lot of time just sitting and breathing and getting a hold of myself and trying to tune into letting go of the thoughts and just being present. Yes. And then all of a sudden, at some point in my practice, a wider awareness comes in. A wider awareness comes in. And all of a sudden, the depth of my practice deepens. That's the best way I can describe it. And suddenly, there's a recognition of something greater is now with me, a part of me, but with me, something greater. And there's a greater sense of peace and love, but also uh, uh, guidance, awareness, a greater awareness. That's the way. That's the one. And so this happens naturally as a progression. The better I'm able to get a hold of myself and hold myself in presence and in awareness allows that greater awareness to come closer or for me to actually experience it more directly. And that's the spiritual field. It's always here, but most of the time I'm not here enough to recognize it or to experience it because I'm so lost in my own stories and I'm absorbed in the mind field of thinking. So it's quite rare that I'll have a moment of, a eureka moment in a way of something bigger is now arising in me in this moment. And people have these spiritual like experiences at various times in life, but we're not necessarily looking for spiritual experiences in this journey together. We're actually trying to develop something much more consistent in our way of being and living. So in a way, most of my practice these days is just staying connected into the wider field so that all my decisions, my energy, my whole way of being comes from a deeply rooted place within my spiritual identity, not just my human, egoic one. And I guess that's what the spiritual journey offers. Now, spirituality, how the spiritual field is named and defined is different for everybody, depending on what your beliefs are, what culture you grew up in, and what language you use. So Christians will call that field God, you know. Buddhists will call it the Buddha nature, an enlightened nature, which is the spiritual field. Muslims will call it Allah. Um, some people call it your higher power, the universe, the source, the oneness of everything. It re it really doesn't matter what it's called. It actually doesn't care what it's called. That's very, very blasphemous of me, but it doesn't really care what it's called. Uh, as long as there's a recognition of something that it's here. And so, what does that, it's kind of like, for a lot of people, and reading, when we last week we looked at what's the definition of the word spirituality, and a lot of it's quite head based. When we're looking for certain, to live spiritually means that we're living with certain values in our life: kindness, goodness, compassion, care for others, right? And they're all really important values. But where do they come from? You see, I was never really a big fan of values that were just programmed into me because I was told to do them and told to believe them. Because they don't always stick, But really, spiritual values arise from one place mainly. When we connect to the spiritual field, which is the interconnectivity of all people and all beings, the recognition that I am connected to the rest of humanity and more than that, that's where spiritual values arise out of, that experience, the recognition that I'm part of rather than separate from, which is the ego's experience. So if I'm separate from the rest of humanity, from the ego's position, then basically I don't really care about everybody else in the same way. I can pretend to, or I could do it out of some kind of, inherited belief system. Sure. But if I'm immersed, if I immerse myself in the spiritual field, which is everybody else as well, then of course I care, because it's a form of altruism. Caring for myself means actually caring for everybody else too, at that level of consciousness. And that's so important. Now, the other thing the spiritual field does, of course, it's what is it? What is it? It's it's energetic. It's an energy field that connects us all together. Is it and and it's an energy field of awareness and love that can only really but you can only know that by experiencing it. So a lot of people, we can read about it, people can tell you these things, and these are all what's called mythic poetic statements. They sound wonderful, but they mean nothing unless you experience something yourself. And then you can resonate and go, oh, yes, I resonate. Or like this evening, I'm trying to transmit something energetically beyond the words. Beyond the words, I'm trying to transmit the field into the Zoom room, that sense that we are all one and connected. And imagine how we would care for each other and the planet if we really embodied that knowing as a collective rather than allowing the ego collective to run riot as it's doing so much in the world today, you know. So the more I connect into the field, this is another part of my identity. The more I connect into the spiritual field, the more I'm shifting my identity from the ego as the source of myself to something much deeper and broader as the source of my identity. Until finally the ego begins to surrender its position. And what a relief that can be. What a relief that is. Ah. And the freedom that then comes to be your egoic small self is truly amazing because the fear is gone. The fears are gone because you now know something of yourself that's much greater than the small ego that you thought we were, that I thought I was, you know. And when I connect into the field, which I do all the time, there's a great sense of feeling that I'm being held, that I'm being held and supported and loved even, no matter what's going on in my life, you know. And this is the part of the self that lives on. This is the part of the self that continues, so the spirit lives on of the person, goes back to the field. Very an Irish analogy, isn't it? But it goes back to the field, and there's various stages to that, ultimately back to the soul. So this this is a whole identity transformation, isn't it? It's kind of like the flower in the field that thinks it's special. I am special. I'm the special flower. And in order for me to be special, somebody else in the field is not special. Rather than recognizing, no, I'm a unique flower, and obviously getting to know and live my life as this flower is a very unique and wonderful experience. At times it's painful, of course, and difficult and horrible, but it's all part of the human experience. But then, the spirituality offers us, okay, you are the flower, but you're also the entire field at the same time. And what if you embrace that part of yourself? What's that going to do? What's it going to do for you to embrace that part? But a lot of people, they can only identify as the flower and they get stuck there. And then there's no good or bad to that. It just means there'll still be a lot of suffering. So there's two types of suffering. One is the suffering of being human, being the flower, which isn't real suffering. Unfortunately, some people don't like hearing that. So as a human being, I feel pain, I feel loss, I feel heartbreak. I have all sorts of I get sick, I'm going to die physically. This is all human suffering. And some traditions would say it's not even suffering, it's just being human. Get used to it. It's just being human, get used to it. But the real suffering is called existential suffering, where I'm a flower deeply connected into the field, but deeply disconnected from the field. And the emptiness that that creates is the real suffering. I don't know who I am beyond this simple image I have of myself as the flower. I've never experienced the field and the depths of myself. And that's the real suffering people have today. There isn't any depth to their identity, their sense of who they are. There's nobody. The lights are on, but there's nobody home. Isn't that what we say? You know, and how sad that is. I never got to experience the the deeper parts of myself. I was too, I was too conditioned to the external world that as the flower. And there'll always be suffering then until I come home. And that's a Buddhist term, isn't it? Coming home to myself is a Buddhist term, you know, or in the Christian story, coming home to the indwelling divine. So until that happens, there'll always be the suffering of separation, the loneliness, the emptiness, the sense of something's missing in my life. I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know why I'm here. And ultimately, I really don't know who I am beyond the roles that I've played over the years in various shapes and forms as the flower. Right. Let me just change the view.